In this video, we will be talking about the context of the Gospel of Mark. Let's begin by talking about the authorship and dating of the Gospel of Mark. Now, for most people, it might be self-evident that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. This is not necessarily the case. The Markan authorship of the book is usually attributed to early Christian writers. And these writers usually considered John Mark, the companion of Peter, to be the author of this text. This book, as well as the other Gospels and most of the New Testament, we can't really say was written by the people whose names are on it, or not. For the most part, we're going to label this book as an anonymous authorship. What's interesting about this text is that we do not get this idea that this is an eyewitness account. There is no place in this gospel that claims that the author was an eyewitness to the events of Jesus' life. However this information was passed down, we aren't sure, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the Synoptic Gospels video. But we do know that the author probably lived quite a bit after Jesus' lifetime. In fact, most scholars date this book to 66 to 70 CE. Jesus' crucifixion is probably around 33 CE, so you have a discrepancy of about 33 years here. So this person might have been alive during Jesus' lifetime, but probably wasn't writing during their life. Now this dating is because of some major events, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. But what's important to note is that Mark is probably the oldest of the four Gospels in the New Testament. The audience for this book was probably a group of Gentile Christians. Most scholars believe this because Mark explains some things throughout the text that Jewish readers would already have known. Mark also seems not to understand some Jewish practices that would have been understood if he were actually a Jewish person. For example, Mark talks about Jews washing their hands before they eat, but this practice was not necessarily universal in Judaism at Mark's time. There are three major ideas on where he was writing from or to for this text. First, and this is the most traditional view, is that Mark was writing in Rome. This is because there was talk about earthquakes and wars. This does not necessarily make the case that Mark was writing in the city of Rome. More recent views argue that Mark was writing from Galilee or from southern Syria. Now, when we talk about the authorial intent of the Gospel of Mark, there's a twofold idea here. The first is that whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark is focused on preserving the tradition that he learned about Jesus. Whether this tradition was passed down from somebody else, or whether he in fact did witness Jesus' life himself, the author of Mark was focused on preserving this tradition and passing it down to later generations. Most scholars note that Mark probably began as an oral tradition and kept on going that way, with phrases like "and immediately," just like you might use in everyday conversation. The other focus of the Gospel of Mark is encouraging the Jewish Christians, the Gentile Christians, who are being persecuted by the Romans, to persevere and keep strong, even through their suffering. As we look at some of the themes, we'll notice that this theme of suffering pops up throughout Mark, so it was important for Mark to encourage his audience to persevere even through their suffering. Some of the historical background for the Gospel of Mark is understanding who the Emperor Nero was. What's important about the Emperor Nero here is that in 64 CE, there was a great fire of Rome. Now Nero, as you might know, was famous for being antagonistic towards Jews and towards Christians. We'll talk a little bit more about him when we get to the letter to the Romans later in this course. The Great Fire of Rome was a fire that broke out throughout the city of Rome, as you might imagine. And who started it is still a mystery to many people today. Nero claimed that the Christians started the fire, giving him more fuel to persecute the Christians. Some, probably conspiracy theorists, claim that Nero started the fire himself as a way to give himself a reason to hate the Christians even more. Whoever started this fire, it does not matter, because the fire was what inspired excessive persecution towards Christians, including martyrdom. Now, martyrdom is where a Christian would not, or anybody else, would not deny their beliefs and would subject themselves to death. There are several themes to note throughout the Gospel of Mark. The first of these is that Jesus is considered to be the Son of God. Now, the Son of God might seem like an honorific title to most 21st century readers. There are a few things to note here. The first thing is, again, this is pushing back against the Roman Empire. The Roman Emperor himself would be called a son of God because Roman emperors were deified. So his father before him would have been a son of God and would have been a god before passing that down to his son. Therefore, Jesus claiming that he is the Son of God would put himself on the level of the Roman Emperor. Son of God was also used in the Hebrew Bible to talk about the kings of Israel. So King David would have been a son of God. On a less honorific level, Son of God was simply used for the Israelite people. They were called children of God. So when Jesus is identified as a Son of God, this is not necessarily indicating anything about his divinity, but simply that he is either on the level of the Roman Emperor, or that he is a king of Israel, or simply that he is an Israelite person. We also see Jesus perform many miracles throughout the Gospel of Mark. Again, miracles were not something that were uncommon at this time. When we read the text in the 21st century, we might miss out on this. We probably don't see people performing miracles on the sidewalk in an office building. But in Jesus' time period, miracles would be common of the legends of the Greek and Roman gods. The heroes, as well as the gods themselves, could perform miracles. Israelite figures throughout the Hebrew Bible, like the prophets Elijah and Elisha, also performed miracles, such as even raising the dead. And some rabbinical miracle workers also performed miracles as well, like healing people, and providing food. An interesting aspect of the Gospel of Mark is the messianic secret. We don't find this to the same extent in the other Gospels, but in the Gospel of Mark, we see in Mark 1:44 that Jesus says, "See that you say nothing to anyone." The idea here is that Jesus being the Messiah is a secret. Nobody can know about it. Whether Mark, the author, made this up, or whether Jesus was the one who did not want to reveal it to cause any trouble among Jews or among Gentiles, we aren't really sure, but this messianic secret becomes a major theme in the Gospel of Mark. The theme of discipleship also comes up. You'll see the disciples in the other Gospels as well, but one important thing in the Gospel of Matthew is that discipleship means suffering. Now, suffering is a major and perhaps the most major theme of the Gospel of Mark. We see Jesus as a suffering Messiah. To be the Messiah, to be the Anointed One, and fulfill whatever Jesus' legacy is, he has to suffer. We also see that discipleship necessarily requires suffering. In chapter 6, we see John the Baptist proclaiming Jesus' good news, which results in his death. Discipleship results in suffering and can even possibly result in death. including martyrdom, dying for one's cause. Discipleship, in this case, did not necessarily mean required suffering and death, however. Jesus calls his disciples not necessarily to roll over and die when they are being oppressed, but to resist the oppression. Whatever suffering they endure is supposed to bring about triumph because of the good news of Christ. What's interesting when we see Jesus as the Messiah in this text is that the disciples misunderstand who he is. We most notably see this with Peter. Jesus understands himself fulfilling the Hebrew scriptures in a certain way that his disciples, as mostly Jewish themselves, do not see Jesus as doing. This would be because they were schooled in a certain way of thought that was not how Jesus interpreted these scriptures, even though Jesus himself was Jewish. Jesus' interpretation of these scriptures was revolutionary, thinking that he embodied the scriptures in a certain way. When it came to the Messiah in Judaism, there were many different schools of thought. Some Jews thought that there would be a Messiah who would simply return them from exile. Some thought that the Messiah would be a priest, and few thought that there would be a king. What most Jews did not think was that there would be somebody who acted as a servant to others and would still embody this anointed one of the Messiahship. Finally, and perhaps most notably in the Gospel of Mark as opposed to the other Gospels, is Jesus being the Son of Man. Now, we'll talk about his humanity for a moment, but Son of Man does not necessarily mean that. We see the word Son of Man used in a couple different settings throughout the Hebrew Bible, which is the context for the Gospel of Mark. In the first place, we see it used throughout Ezekiel as well as Psalms to talk about humans. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus as a very human person. Again, the suffering Messiah idea permeates the book, and Jesus suffers. Jesus even longs not to have to be crucified, which we see in the Garden of Gethsemane scene. We also see that Jesus is not always omniscient or omnipotent, meaning he doesn't know and cannot always do everything. In chapter 6 of Mark, in verse 5, we see that he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. We see this in a couple places throughout the Gospel of Mark. Most 21st century readers simply skip over this and do not notice that Jesus seems not to be able to do this because of our idea of what Christ should be like. We also see that he's not necessarily omniscient. In 5:9, Jesus asks this demon what his name is. The demon replies, "My name is Legion, for we are many." This is something that someone who is omniscient would already know. And while this might be rhetorical, there are other instances, such as in 5:30, where Jesus is unaware of who touched his clothes, just aware that power had gone out of him. We also typically consider the Messiah or Jesus to be sinless. And while there's nothing in the text that indicates this is or is not the case, we do see in 1:4 that John the Baptist is baptizing for remission of sins, and Jesus himself is baptized by John. There's no discussion of whether this is different from most people's baptism or not. We don't see any discussion throughout the Gospel of Mark about the virgin birth. So this idea that Jesus comes into the world sinless does not exist in this gospel. While we do see Jesus as a Son of Man who is human, the Son of Man phrase can also be used to mean a heavenly redeemer or angel. And we see this in the book of Daniel as well as the non-canonical book of 1st Enoch in the Jewish tradition. So when we talk about Jesus as the Son of Man, it's not clear which of these two ways it's intended. It could be both. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the Gospel, describe the historical setting and context of the Gospel, and identify the themes in the Gospel and give examples of how they are used in the text.